to publish recently. So it's just classic. And they used to have these wonderful jazz, concerts at the Red Onion. So when I was a little girl, my mother and father would take me to the Red Onion, and I'd sort of hide under the tables. And there would be the most famous jazz musicians. Louis Armstrong played there. And it was quite a wonderful gathering. Most of the people in Aspen at that time loved jazz music. And it was even before Gibson started his jazz.
Well, the Red Onion, when I was there, the Red Onion was still one of those little local places that had stuff. I remember when Gary Hart came to college, started this big thing about going through Colorado and trying to become, run for president. And Red Onion was where he came and did one of his big sort of announcements that he was going to run.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's when Werner Kuster owned it.
Yeah.
And Werner had, both sides. There was the old side, the original Red Onion.
Yeah.
And then there was the newer one that they built.
Yeah.
And that was the fancy side.
Yeah.
Let's see, Walt Smith used to play there too, with Harold Whitcomb, and I can't remember who else, maybe even Dr. O'Dane or somebody. But I do remember that they ended up years later playing at the Sopris down Valley. So my mom would go to that, and I'd go with her sometimes, and that was always fun to see those guys playing jazz.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I wonder if the famous folks would just jump on stage with them. Do you know?
Yeah. So what's the name of that museum down Valley in Carbondale? John Powers. So John Powers used to play with Walt Smith.
Oh, yeah.
And he was a, huge collector of art. He collected Andy Warhol and Jasper Johns. And, when you go into that museum, you can see his collection. But John Powers' love was to play the saxophone. And he played the saxophone at one of the openings of my shows at the Barney Wyckoff Gallery back in the early 90s. And he really supported music. In fact, I have 2 old posters that he had some of these guys create. Roy Lichtenstein was one of them. Ooh. And they're the jazz posters for the jazz festivals. And John Powers also brought Roy Lichtenstein, Andy Warhol, Jasper Johns, and several other people to and gave them all studios in Aspen, which was at the time in the Brand Building upstairs. It was just a funky old place. And I used to go up there and watch all these artists creating work, but I had no idea who they were because I was so young. And he offered each one of them 40 acres of land if they would stay in Aspen and make Aspen their home, because he was trying to create an artist community here. And nobody took him up on it. They all went back to New York. And in fact, his wife, Kimiko, is the Japanese lady who Andy Warhol did a beautiful silkscreen of. And that was his wife.
Wow.
That's funny.
Yeah, that, growing up and all that, it's kind of interesting because the whole fame thing and the whole fan thing, it's almost as if you live in with the family. In other words, a lot of those folks came to Aspen to just blend in and be part of the community. And so there was this community thing there. So it was now it kind of doesn't feel, it's kind of flip-flopped. Because before it was more like people just getting down to the ground level and just not worrying about anything, they come to go hang out with Hunter, or they came to hang out with other folks. But now it's a little bit more like business meetings, it's a little bit more like a tax write-off of a place to have your corporate,
Well, Judy, you mentioned some of the art galleries downtown, and to Andy's point, to illustrate that, and I don't know if it's still the same, but at the time they had to be less discerning on what type of people could come in and browse the galleries. I remember seeing stuff in the galleries up there in the 80s and the 90s that was, like super famous artists, Jean Miro and, folks like that were part of the surrealism. And anybody could walk in there and the dealers or the docents or whoever was working at the gallery at the time had to treat them on an equal level. And I think there's partially a cultural thing there of the old Aspen. And I think there was also the notion that literally anyone could walk into a gallery and drop $250,000 on something wearing a pair of jeans with holes in it and a rat's nest hair, you know. And I just remember my mom we walked into one, it was a Jay Madison gallery, and she really fell in love with one of the pieces on the wall. There were two of them. They were Sam Francis. One was a print and one was a painting. And she said to Jay, she said, yeah, I really like that one. How much is that? He said, oh, that's $650. And she said, okay, well, let me just write a check. That's easy enough. And he says, well, we're going to need to have a certified check for that much. And she's like, $650? And he was like, no, $650,000. And she was like, oh, well, how much for the painting? And he was like, well, that's almost double that. So
gosh. Well, you know, in the early days,
walked in, you know, so.
When I was young, I was 13. So the very first job I had in town was working at the Aspen Frame Shop, which was located behind Tom Benton's studio. Okay. So I met Tom Benton and I met Hunter Thompson. And so Tom asked me to start helping him do his silk screens. So I would pull the silk screens. When he would lift up the screen, I'd pull it out and put it on the drying rack. And so I spent a lot of time working with Tom, and it was such a beautiful environment because people would come in all the time while he was working and talk about the politics in Aspen and the politics in the country. And Hunter Thompson was one of his best friends. So he came in all the time and I had no idea what they were talking about. I was just sitting there pulling the screens. And then we also would do sort of political campaigns. And when I was in high school, there was the big atomic energy blast down in Rulison.
Yeah,
I remember. Yeah,
remember that?
Yeah.
And so we made all of the signs that we walked around with. Tom and I made all those signs to in opposition to this atomic energy blast. And so it was just, and the No Olympics, because they wanted to have the Olympics in Aspen. Do you remember that?
Yep.
Yeah. So we made all the No Olympic signs. And so I just felt like I lived in such a glorious time of Aspen, all of us did, when it was much more intimate and you knew everybody in town. You knew you could go to the Wiener Stube and know everybody there, and there was the joiners table. And I was just missing yesterday thinking, I used to love going to the Wiener Stube on a Sunday with my family and seeing, you just knew all the cooks, the waitresses, the people. It was just such a community social event, Sunday at the Wiener Stube. And so the art, I think the art galleries have really changed in Aspen. It's not quite so intimate. There's some beautiful art there. There's some wonderful galleries, but it's not like it was in the old days. Yeah.
Well, is it, it's funny because Benton really affected a lot of us kids. And so like you were pulling screens for him, so were the Pelletiers, Francois and Renee. So it's interesting because generation of generation were influenced by the folks there. And I feel like that's part of what, when you talk about the galleries, that's part of what I miss is there were local artists like Herbie Balderson did all the glasses at the Chart House,
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like that kind of bowls, and his bowls were amazing. The spun bowls that he would make, and I feel like
bowls.
I feel like that local kind of thing is. I mean, last time I went there, I saw Chuck Close, which I love Chuck Close, but at the same time, he doesn't live there, And that's one of the things I loved about seeing the Tom Benton posters around is that I knew him and I knew where they were. I knew where they were pulled from, And whereas I feel like now I go in and check things out and it's like as if the same people have a gallery in New York or Beverly Hills or Dallas. and I don't really see the, what's his name, David Floria, who has really sort of reached into the community. He was the one who sort of had community shows and then had a few things to kind of show folks what's going on outside to bring that in. But it was really emphasized, his big star show was the local show, which my mom was in, and a couple people had their stuff in there. And I felt like that's they're starting to bring it back a little bit. I don't know. I mean, I heard Valerie Moore talking about that a little bit because
DJ Watkins has, a gallery now in town, and he has committed to be showing local artists within the Roaring Fork Valley.
Cool.
So that's really a wonderful thing. And what I wish they would bring back, which was such a beautiful and wonderful event, was the local show at the Aspen Art Museum. When everybody just got to put in a piece. All the kids from school, all the local artists.
Yeah.
I do miss that. And one of the things that I did in my early days was I went around to the restaurants in Aspen and asked if I could show my work in the restaurants, because I couldn't get into the galleries because no one knew who I was. And so I started showing my work at Poppycock's and down in Basalt at different restaurants. And I did the same thing over here in Telluride. When I first moved here, I went around to the restaurants and said, hey, can we use your walls for art shows to promote the local artists so that they have an opportunity to make a living with their art? And now you have to get on a waiting list for like a year. And you get 1 month out of the year, and hopefully you can get a month. But it's such a wonderful place to show work, because a lot of people who don't go to art galleries always go to eat,
Right.
And so they would go in and see your work, and that's how many people discovered, including Yvonne Chenard, who bought a couple pieces from me. And some of the gallery owners in other areas around the world saw my work in restaurants. So that's a wonderful thing when they can switch around shows in restaurants and allow people to be shown. I
had a show at the Howling Wolf in the 90s. I don't remember if you remember or not, but there was, I think it was Good Morning America or somebody was coming up. They were going to do a big show all about Aspen. They were interviewing locals and stuff. And the week that they were there, they went through the Howling Wolf and they were going to film. And I was like, my art's going to be on TV. But what happened was they came the week before and filmed Hunter Thompson's stuff on the same walls, and then just B-rolled it into this stuff. And I was so dejected. I was like, I can't compete with Hunter Thompson with a shotgun and paintballs or whatever he was doing,
Oh yeah, I know.
It's hard. It's hard getting stuff out there, but